100 years ago, on April 10th, 1912, the Titanic set sail.
The Titanic, the largest ship the world had ever seen, and her end was the greatest maritime disaster known.
I felt a sudden, vibrating jar run through the ship.
Then, and not until then, did I realize the horror of an accident at sea.
These are the stories of the ship's passengers and crew, in their own words.
I was in a whirlpool of water, swirling round and round as I still tried to cling to the railing as the ship plunged to the depths below.
Beautiful Titanic, gone to her doom.
In this film, diaries, letters, and memoirs are set to dramatic reconstruction and images of the time to evoke the spirit of Titanic's fateful voyage. In 1912, the two richest and most powerful cities in the world, New York and London, were linked by the world's most important shipping route. Now, a new ship had been launched that was equal to their wealth and status. The ship was being fitted out in this Belfast dry dock when her officers came to join her. Amongst them was Charles Lightoller.
It is difficult to convey any idea of the size of a ship like the Titanic when you could actually walk miles along decks and passages. It took me 14 days before I could, with confidence, find my way from one part of that ship to another by the shortest route.
For Lightoller, the Titanic was a promotion, and he had the honor of conducting her sea trials.
Everybody's admiration of the ship increased. For the way she behaved, for the total absence of vibration, for her steadiness.
On April the 2nd, Titanic left for Southampton. There, her full complement of 900 crew joined the ship. They came from all walks of life. One stewardess was 24-year-old Violet Jessup, the daughter of Irish immigrants who had moved to London in search of work.
Everything struck us as wonderful about this second new ship, Titanic. It was, therefore, like a big expectant family that we joined her. Even Jenny, the ship's cat, and part of the crew, had immediately picked herself a comfortable corner. We enthused over the novel idea of small, private decks for the best suites. The superb lace bedspreads we each had in our sections. We marvelled at the masterpieces of woodcarver's art from Ireland and Holland. Surely there was nothing missing to satisfy the long list of distinguished names on the first-class passenger list.
On April the 10th, passengers joined Titanic for her maiden voyage. Lawrence Beasley was a public school science teacher on his first foreign trip. He paid £13, the equivalent of £1,000 today, for a second-class cabin.
I inspected the various decks, dining saloons and libraries, and so extensive were they that it is no exaggeration to say that it was quite easy to lose one's way on such a ship. We wandered casually into the gymnasium on the boat deck and were engaged in bicycle exercise when the instructor came in with 2 photographers and insisted on our remaining there while his friends, as we thought at the time, made a record for him of his apparatus in use. It was only later that we discovered that they were the photographers of one of the illustrated London papers.
We went aboard and found our cabin. It's most beautifully fitted and the white paint shines like a mirror, and the rest is mahogany with silver-plated fittings. We have 2 hanging wardrobes, several drawers, in fact plenty of space for everything.
Titanic had 1,300 passengers. There were 700 in third class, or steerage, 280 in second class, and 325 in first class. One of them was Colonel Archibald Gracie, a New Yorker returning home after spending the winter in the south of France. His ticket cost £29, around 3,000 in today's money. Even the wealthy Gracie found Titanic extravagant.
Pleasure and comfort, which all of us enjoyed upon this floating palace, with its extraordinary provisions for such purposes, seemed an ominous feature to many of us, including myself, who felt it almost too good to last without some terrible retribution inflicted by the hand of an angry omnipotence.
My husband had a strange premonition at Southampton. As we entered the big gates leading to the pier, he turned back suddenly, and his face went white. "What is it?" I asked. "Oh, nothing," he said. Later he told me he felt something was going to happen.
At midday, Titanic set sail. Before she even left the harbor, there was a brush with disaster. As she moved from the dock, Titanic's huge size created a current which nearly caused a smaller ship to collide with her.
To the casual observer, the whole incident would have been just a thrill. Perhaps not much more, even though there had been a collision. But for us, it would have been something deeper. A ship can hate her men, and then she frequently becomes known as a killer.
For 3 days, Titanic steamed westwards into the North Atlantic, covering more than 500 miles in a day.
I enjoyed myself as if I were in a summer palace on the seashore, surrounded with every comfort. There was nothing to indicate or suggest that we were on the stormy Atlantic Ocean. The motions of ship and the noise of its machinery was scarcely discernible on deck or in the salons, either day or night.
My dear Mum and Dad, it doesn't seem possible we're out on the briny writing to you. So far we're having a delightful trip. The weather is beautiful and the ship magnificent. It's like a floating town.
I was up early before breakfast and met the professional racket player in a half hour's warming up, preparatory for a swim in the 6-foot-deep tank of salt water, heated to a refreshing temperature. In no swimming bath had I ever enjoyed such pleasure.
It was all so happy and peaceful. If the sun did fail to shine so brightly on the 4th day out, and if a little cold nip crept into the air as the evening set in, it only served to emphasize the warmth and luxuriousness within. Greyish skies replaced sunshine, but the calm sea continued. The calmness that only the ocean knows. Perfect serenity for miles.
The change in the weather troubled few passengers. But messages from other ships warned the crew of unusual sea conditions ahead.
On Sunday morning, April 14th, this marvelous ship, the perfection of all vessels hitherto conceived by the brain of man, had for 3½ days proceeded on her way from Southampton to New York over a sea of glass, So level it appeared.
I can look back and see every detail of the library that afternoon. The beautifully furnished room with lounges, armchairs and small writing or card tables scattered about.
Night fell. At 20 minutes to midnight, Titanic was steaming west at 20 knots, 1,000 miles from the American coast.
There came what seemed to me nothing more than an extra heave of the engines and a more than usually obvious dancing motion of the mattress on which I sat. Nothing more than that. No sound of a crash or anything else. No sense of shock. No jar that felt like one heavy body meeting another.
I was just ready for the land of Nod when I felt a sudden vibrating jar run through the ship. It was not by any means a violent concussion, but just a distinct and unpleasant break in the monotony of her motion.
Titanic slowed and stopped. To most of her passengers and crew, there was no further sign there was anything amiss. At midnight on April the 15th, 1912, the Titanic has stopped unexpectedly in the middle of the North Atlantic.
Such a biting cold air poured into my stateroom that I could not sleep. And the air had so strange an odour, as if it came from a clammy cave. I've always loved both day and night on shipboard, and I'm never fearful of anything, but now I was nervous about the icy air.
I jumped out of bed, slipped on a dressing gown over my pyjamas, put on my shoes, and went out of the cabin into the hall near the saloon. Here was a steward leaning against the staircase, and I said, "Why have we stopped?" "I don't know, sir," he replied. "I don't suppose it's anything much." "Well," I said, "I'm going on deck to see what it is," and started towards the stairs. He smiled indulgently as I passed him and said, "All right, sir, but it's mighty cold up there."
My friend was by this time dressed, pretending to eat a sandwich. Her hand shook so that the bread kept parting company from the chicken. And I saw she was frightened. And for the first time I was too.
The fourth officer, Boxall, opened my door and, seeing me awake, quietly said, "We've hit an iceberg." I replied, "I know you've hit something." He then said, "The water is up to F deck in the mailroom." That was quite sufficient. Not another word passed.
An officer's cat passed the door. I asked, "Is there an accident or danger of any kind?" "None so far as I know," was his courteous answer, spoken quietly and most kindly. This same officer entered a cabin a little distance down the companionway, and by this time, distrustful of everything, I listened intently and distinctly heard, "We can keep the water out for a while." Then, and not until then, did I realize the horror of an accident at sea.
Through the windows of the smoking room, we saw a game of cards going on, with several onlookers, and I went in to inquire if they knew more than we did. One of them had seen through the windows an iceberg go by, towering above the decks. The general impression was that we had just scraped the iceberg with a glancing blow on the starboard side, and they had stopped as a wise precaution. One of the players pointing to his glass of whiskey standing at his elbow, said, "Just run along the deck and see if any ice has come aboard. I would like some for this." When he spoke, the forward deck was covered with ice.
There was about 2 feet of ice lying in the scuppers on the starboard side. It was very bright overhead, and there was a tremendous number of stars, but there was also a slight mist on the water. I did not stay on the top deck long, as I did not regard things as serious. We all thought she was unsinkable.
At 5 minutes past midnight on April the 15th, Titanic sent out a distress call.
Require assistance. Position 41 degrees, 46 minutes north, 50 degrees, 14 minutes west. Struck iceberg. Titanic.
A watchman came and said, "All hands in the saloon." That was the first order. And while we were getting ready, the second steward came down and said, "Every man get on deck at once. Put on warm clothing and lifebelts."
Good, faithful old Stanley, one of my bedroom stewards, came knocking at the door. His face whiter than usual as he remarked casually, "I'm calling on all our people, sister." He always addressed me as sister when we were alone. "Anything you'd like me to do for you on my way? You know the ship is sinking." Sinking? Of course, Titanic couldn't be sinking. What nonsense. She is so perfect, so new. Yet now she was so still. So inanimate.
Put on some underclothing, sat on the sofa and read for some 10 minutes, when I heard a loud shout from above. "All passengers on deck with lifebelts on."
Shepherded by the crew, passengers began streaming up from below deck. The rule, women and children first, was to be strictly enforced.
My mother dressed me and took me by the hand and led me upstairs. I had a big dolly that I got 2 Christmases before, and we were in such a hurry that I left it behind. I cried for my dolly, but we couldn't go back.
I had returned to my room when I saw Stanley at the door again, watching me. He almost shouted as he seized my arm, "My God, don't you realise that the ship will sink? That she's struck an iceberg, that you have to follow the rest upstairs as quickly as possible?" I tied on a borrowed scarf, locked the door and called out, "So long, Stan. Come up soon yourself, won't you?" Halfway up, I looked down and waved to Stan. He was standing with his arms clasped behind him in the corner where he usually kept his evening watch. He suddenly looked very tired.
We passed by the palm room, where 2 short hours before we had listened to a beautiful concert. Just happy, laughing men and women constantly passing up and down those broad, strong staircases. How different are those staircases now? No laughing throng, but on either side, quietly, bravely, the stewards, all equipped with the white, ghostly life preservers.
Few passengers yet believed that Titanic could sink.
There was no panic or hysteria, no cries of fear, and no running to and fro to discover what was the matter. But all the time people were pouring up from the stairs and adding to the crowd.
Titanic says, "Tell Captain we are putting the passengers off in small boats." Ask the Titanic what weather he had. He says calm and clear. Our distance from Titanic, 505 miles.
Out of Titanic's 2,200 passengers and crew, the ship's 20 lifeboats only had room for 1,000. Women and children were loaded first.
I helped in the loading of 2 boats lowered from the deck above. It was now that the band began to play and continued while the boats were being lowered. We considered this a wise provision, tending to allay excitement. There was not one woman who shed tears or gave any sign of fear or distress. There was not a man at this quarter of the ship who indicated desire to get into the boats and escape with the women. There was not a member of the crew who shirked or left his post. The coolness, courage, and sense of duty that I here witnessed made me thankful to God and proud of my Anglo-Saxon race that gave this perfect and superb exhibition of self-control at this hour of severest trial.
We went onto the boat deck where women were already getting into lifeboats. My father helped us into a lifeboat and then turned away. That was the last I ever saw of him. I saw him standing there with his back towards us. He never turned round for us to see him.
The awful goodbyes, the quiet look of hope in the brave men's eyes as the wives were put into the lifeboats.
An officer said we should all put on life preservers, and my mother put one on me and fastened one around herself. Papa put one on too. I was crying for my dolly, but no one could go back and get her. Then someone said we should all get in boats, and then my father lifted me up and put me in a boat.
Between one boat being lowered away and the next boat being prepared, I usually nipped along to have a look down the very long emergency staircase leading direct from the boat deck down to sea deck, to gauge the speed with which the water was rising. That cold green water, crawling its ghostly way up that staircase, was a sight that stamped itself indelibly on my memory.
Titanic's passengers still had no idea what lay ahead for them. But her crew now knew the ship was doomed. Two hours after Titanic hit the iceberg, it was clear that the ship would soon sink. In the rush, the remaining lifeboats often left half full.
Our lifeboat, with 36 in it, began lowering to the sea. This was done amid the greatest confusion. Rough seamen all giving different orders, no officer aboard. As only one side of the ropes worked, the lifeboat at one time was in such a position that it seemed we must capsize in mid-air.
I went to fill up boat 13 and got about 35 women and children into it. We shouted for more women, but there were none forthcoming. We had a few first-class male passengers in. An officer ordered 2 of us to get in and help row the boat. And I happened to be one of the fortunate ones to be ordered in.
My arm was suddenly jerked, and I turned to see young Mason, who had been busy filling a boat. His face looked weary and tired, but he gave a bright smile as he ordered my group into the boat, calling out, "Good luck," as we stepped in, helped by his willing, guiding hand. Then young Mason hailed me and held something up, calling as he prepared to throw it, "Look after this, will you?" And I reached out to receive somebody's forgotten baby in my arms.
A report went round the men on the top deck, the starboard side, that men were to be taken off on the port side. It was acted on by almost all the men, leaving the starboard side almost deserted. I can personally think of no decision arising from reasoned thought that induced me to remain rather than to cross over. Almost immediately after this, I heard a cry from below of, "Any more ladies?" and looking over the edge of the deck, saw a lifeboat. The boat was almost full and just about to be lowered. The call for ladies was repeated twice again, but apparently there were none to be found. Just then, one of the crew looked up and saw me looking over. "Any ladies on your deck?" he said. "No," I replied. "Then you'd better jump." I sat on the edge, dropped, and fell in the boat near the stern.
Lawrence Beasley was one of only 14 out of 168 second-class male passengers who made it into the lifeboats. Only now did the lucky few in the boats realize the magnitude of what was happening.
Imagine a ship nearly a sixth of a mile long, with her hundreds of portholes, all her saloons and other rooms brilliant with light, and all around her, little boats filled with those who until a few hours before had trod her decks and read in her libraries and listened to the music of her band in happy content, and who were now looking up in amazement at the enormous mass above them and rowing away from her because she was sinking.
I started unconsciously to count the decks by the rows of lights. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I stopped. Surely I had miscounted. I went over them again more carefully, hushing the whimpering baby meanwhile. No, I had made no mistake. There were only 5 decks now. Then I started all over again. Only 4 now.
The sea level and the rows of lights should have been parallel, should never have met. And now they met at an angle inside the black hull of the ship. There was nothing else to indicate she was injured. Nothing but the apparent violation of that simple geometrical law.
1,500 people remained on board, with no hope now of escape.
When I first saw and realized that every lifeboat had left the ship, the sensation felt was not an agreeable one.
The ship took a slight but definite plunge, probably a bulkhead weight. And the sea came rolling up in a wave, over the steel-fronted bridge, along the deck below us, washing the people back in a dreadful, huddled mass. Those that didn't disappear under the water right away instinctively started to clamber up that part of the deck still out of the water and work their way towards the stern, which was rising steadily out of the water as the bow went down. It was a sight that doesn't bear dwelling on.
There were women in the crowd as well as men, and they seemed to be steerage passengers who had just come up from the decks below.
I knew, only too well, the utter futility of following that driving instinct of self-preservation and struggling up towards the stern. It would only be postponing the plunge and prolonging the agony, even lessening one's already slim chances by becoming one of a crowd. There was only one thing to do, and I might just as well do it and get it over. So, turning to the fore part of the bridge, I took a header.
I was in a whirlpool of water, swirling round and round as I still tried to cling to the railing as the ship plunged to the depths below. Down, down I went, it seemed a great distance.
Huge rectangular air shaft right to the bottom of the ship, covered with a wire netting. I suddenly found myself drawn and held flat against this. The pressure of the water just glued me there whilst the ship sank slowly below the surface. Although I struggled and kicked for all I was worth, it was impossible to get away. For as fast as I pushed myself off, I was irresistibly dragged back, every instant expecting the wire to go, find myself shot down into the bowels of the ship. Apart from that, I was drowning.
She tilted slowly up, and there she remained, motionless. As she swung up, her lights, which had shone without a flicker all night, went out suddenly, came on again for a single flash, then went out altogether. And in this position, she continued for some minutes, I think as much as 5 minutes. Then, first sinking back a little at the stern, I thought, she slid slowly forward through the water and dived slantingly down.
With a thundering roar of underwater explosions, our proud ship, our beautiful Titanic, gone to her doom.
She left us with something we would willingly forget forever, something which it is not well to let the imagination dwell on. The cries of many hundreds of our fellow passengers struggling in the ice-cold water, a cry that called to the heavens for the very injustice of its own existence, a cry that clamoured for its own destruction.
Amongst those sucked down by the ship was Charles Lightoller.
I was still struggling and fighting when suddenly a terrific blast of hot air came up the shaft and blew me right away from the air shaft and onto the surface. There were many around in the water by this time, some swimming, others, mostly men, thank God, definitely drowning.
Archibald Gracie was still being pulled underwater.
It was just then that the thought that this was my last moment came upon me. I wanted to convey the news of how I had died to my loved ones at home. As I swam beneath the surface of the ocean, I prayed my spirit would go to them and say, "Goodbye, until we meet again in heaven." To what extent my prayer was answered, let Mrs. Gracie describe in her own words.
I was in my room at my sister's house where I was visiting in New York. After retiring, being unable to rest, I questioned myself several times over, wondering what it was that prevented the peaceful slumber lately enjoyed. "What is the matter?" I uttered. A voice in reply seemed to say, "On your knees and pray." Instantly, I literally obeyed with my prayer book in my hand, which by chance had opened at the prayer, "For those at sea."
Underwater, there came to me a new lease of life and strength, until finally I noticed by the increase of light that I was drawing near to the surface. When my head at last rose above the water, I could see no Titanic in sight.
"20 lifeboats carrying 700 survivors now floated on the empty, freezing ocean. When and if they would be rescued, no one knew. The sensational news that Titanic had hit an iceberg had been relayed by other ships back to America and Europe. Early reports were confused.
On Sunday, the White Star liner Titanic came into collision with an iceberg and immediately flashed out wireless messages for help. It was at length known that every soul was safe and that the vessel herself was proceeding to Halifax, Nova Scotia, towed by the Allen liner Virginian.
But Titanic had sunk, at 2:20 a.m. on April the 15th, leaving 700 survivors in lifeboats 1,000 miles east of the American coast.
We rode for around 7 hours. All the time I was frightened a whole lot, and sometimes I cried. I cried hardest when I thought of my dolly back there, in the water, with nobody to mind it and keep it from getting wet.
As the faint streaks of dawn lit the horizon, majestic shapes of icebergs, like fairy castles, crossed our vision, passing in panoramic procession.
We saw what seemed to be 2 large, fully rigged sailing ships near the horizon. In a few minutes more, the light shone on them, and they stood revealed as huge icebergs, peaked in a way that already suggested a ship.
But help was on its way.
Somebody woke from their lethargic state and pointed a trembling finger at a dark speck on the horizon. A ship.
All night long I had heard a light. Each time it proved to be one of our other lifeboats, someone lighting a piece of paper, anything they could find to burn. And now I could not believe. Someone found a newspaper. It was lighted and held up. Then I looked up and saw a ship. We were to be saved. A straw hat was offered, Mrs. Davidson's. It would burn longer.
The ship was the Cunard liner Carpathia, which had steamed over 300 miles in response to Titanic's distress call. She now began picking up the frozen survivors, one lifeboat at a time.
The lady pulled up just ahead of me was very large, and I felt myself being jerked fearfully when I heard someone say, "Careful, fellas, she's a lightweight." I bumped and bumped against the side of the ship until I felt like a bag of meal.
As we reached the deck, glasses of neat brandy were poured down our throats. It went down like molten fire. While I stood, still clutching the baby in my frozen arms, a woman rushed up, snatched the child and ran away with it. I did wonder why, whoever its mother might be, she had not expressed one word of gratitude for her baby's life. Then started the saddest search it has ever been my lot to witness. Alas, so few were reunited.
Lifeboats kept coming in, and heart-rending was the sight as widow after widow was brought aboard. Each hoped some lifeboat ahead of hers might have brought her husband safely to this waiting vessel. But always, no.
We had to sleep on the floor on the new ship, and it wasn't so nice as it was on the Titanic. But everyone was very kind to us. We thought Papa would be there, but the boat he was on didn't get to the ship.
With the survivors picked up, Carpathia turned for New York.
Deeply regret, advise you Titanic sank this morning, 15th, after collision iceberg, resulting serious loss life. Everything possible being done for comfort of survivors. Please maintain standby.
In New York, anxious relatives besieged White Star's offices for news of their loved ones.
The White Star officials now admit that probably only 675 out of 2,200 passengers on board the Titanic have been saved.
Limited radio communication made it difficult to get accurate information.
At 8 o'clock, my sister, Mrs. Daliber Dutton, came softly to the door, newspaper in hand, to gently break the tragic news that the Titanic had sunk, and showed me a list of only 20 names saved. But my husband's name was not included. I could only pray for strength. And later that day, believing myself a widow, I wrote to my daughter, who was in the care of our housekeeper and servants in our Washington home. Cannot you see your father in his tenderness for women and children, helping them all, and then going down with the ship?
Archibald Gracie had sunk with the ship. After surviving minutes underwater, he'd come to the surface beside an upturned lifeboat. Along with a handful of other men, Gracie had spent the whole night standing on its upside-down, half-sunken hull.
The situation was a desperate one, and was only saved by the refusal of the crew, especially those at the stern of the boat, to take aboard another passenger.
Charles Lightoller had also been on this upturned boat.
No one was in a condition to help. And the fact that a slight but distinct swell had started to roll up rendered help from the still living an impossibility.
But they too had been rescued by the Carpathia.
There were a round total of 711 saved out of 2,201 on board. 1,500 of all ranks and classes had gone to their last account. Apart from 4 junior officers ordered away in charge of boats, I found I was the solitary survivor of over 50 officers and engineers who went down with her.
After 2 days, Carpathia reached New York. The exhausted survivors were unprepared for the reception that awaited them.
Surrounded by tugs of every kind, from which, as well as from every available building near the river, magnesium bombs were shot off by photographers, while reporters shouted for news of the disaster and photographs of the passengers. The Carpathia drew slowly to her station at the Cunard Pier. The gangways were pushed across, and we set foot at last on American soil. Very thankful, grateful people.
Ships were sent to scour the ocean for more survivors. They found only the bodies of the 1,500 who died. Their mass burial at sea was described in the diary of one young sailor, Frederick Hamilton.
51 we've taken on board today. 2 children, 3 women, and 46 men. And still the sea seems strewn. For nearly an hour, the words, "For as much as it hath pleased Almighty God to take himself the souls of our dead brother here departed, we therefore commit his body to the deep," are repeated. And at each interval comes splash. The weighted body plunges into the sea. Let it sink to a depth of about 2 miles. Splash. Splash. Splash.
Many survivors found it hard to put the sinking behind them. Second Officer Charles Lightoller's career was blighted by the association with Titanic. He was passed over for promotion and eventually left White Star Line. He died in 1952. Elizabeth Schutz remained a governess and died unmarried in 1949. Lawrence Beasley went back to work as a school teacher and died in 1967. Violet Jessup, like all of the crew, had her pay stopped from the moment of the sinking. She joined another White Star steamer and died in 1971. Archibald Gracie was reunited with his wife, but soon after he fell ill, and just 8 months after the sinking, he died, aged only 53.
Even the most hardened must reflect the hopes and fears, the dismay, despair of those who's nearest and dearest, the support and pride, have been wrenched from them by this tragedy.
Here on UTV, we move into our late lineup just after 1 a.m. And taking us up to that, we've highlights of the Aviva Premiership Rugby Union coming up next.